I spent 3 days cooking Thanksgiving dinner for my ungrateful family, only to receive a video of them laughing and eating without me, while I sat alone with a table full of food growing cold. They thought sending me that cruel recording was funny, showing my own recipes being devoured by people who couldn't even bother to call and explain why I was suddenly uninvited to my own family gathering. But what they didn't know was that I had been documenting everything for weeks, and their little video just became evidence in the lawsuit that would cost them more than they ever imagined. You see, when you spend 40 years building traditions and feeding people who take your love for granted, you learn to protect yourself in ways they never see coming. And this Thanksgiving was about to become the last meal they'd ever disrespect me over. Before I tell you how I turned their mockery into the most expensive turkey they'll ever taste, let me ask you something that might save your sanity. Have you ever hit that subscribe button on a channel that made you feel less alone in your family trauma? Well, consider this your official invitation to join a community that understands betrayal. So smash that subscribe button like you're crushing their audacity, hit that like button because revenge is about to be served colder than leftover cranberry sauce, and buckle up because what happens next will make you want to screenshot every moment for your own family emergency toolkit. Now let me tell you exactly how my daughter Sarah and her husband Mark thought they could erase me from Thanksgiving while still expecting me to provide the food, and how I made sure they'd never forget the woman who taught them everything they know about consequences. I should have seen it coming when Sarah started making comments about how hosting Thanksgiving was getting too stressful for me, how maybe it was time to pass the torch to the younger generation, how their new house had such a beautiful dining room that would be perfect for family gatherings. But I was so focused on preserving our traditions that I missed the signs of a coup being planned in my own kitchen. For 37 years, I had hosted Thanksgiving in my home, creating memories and maintaining recipes that had been passed down through 4 generations, turning my house into a sanctuary where family came together regardless of their petty disagreements and personal dramas. And Sarah had grown up knowing that Thanksgiving meant coming home to her mother's table, where love was served alongside turkey and acceptance came with every helping of stuffing. But this year was different. Sarah had been dropping hints for months about how times were changing, how her house was more convenient for everyone, how it might be nice for me to be a guest instead of the hostess for once. And like a fool, I thought she was trying to be considerate of my age, rather than plotting to steal my role as the family matriarch. The manipulation started subtly, with Sarah offering to handle the turkey this year because she'd been practicing, asking for my stuffing recipe because she wanted to try making it herself, suggesting that maybe we could split the cooking duties to make things easier for everyone. And I was so proud of her interest in maintaining our family traditions that I didn't realize she was systematically learning to replace me. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Sarah called with what she presented as a generous offer, saying that Mark's parents were coming to town unexpectedly and they decided to host Thanksgiving at their house instead. But not to worry because they'd love for me to come as a guest and just relax for once instead of doing all the work I'd been doing for decades. I should have been suspicious when she emphasized how I deserved to be pampered, how it was time for me to sit back and let others take care of me, how she'd handle everything so I wouldn't have to lift a finger. But instead, I felt a mixture of relief and pride that my daughter wanted to honor me by taking over the family hosting duties. The first red flag should have been when she asked me to write down all my recipes with exact measurements and cooking times, claiming she wanted everything to be perfect and taste just like Mom's cooking. But I was so touched by her dedication to maintaining our family's culinary traditions that I spent hours documenting every secret ingredient and technique I'd developed over 4 decades of perfecting these dishes. I wrote out detailed instructions for my famous herb butter turkey, my grandmother's cornbread stuffing that required a specific type of sage I grew in my own garden, my sweet potato casserole with the brown sugar pecan topping that took me years to perfect, my cranberry sauce made with fresh oranges and a splash of bourbon that nobody else had ever successfully replicated, and even my special gravy technique that involved glazing the pan with white wine and adding a touch of cream that made it silky smooth. Sarah studied those recipes like she was preparing for a doctoral exam, asking follow-up questions about timing and temperature, requesting clarification on techniques that seemed obvious to someone who'd been cooking for decades, and even visiting my kitchen to observe my methods firsthand so she could observe my methods firsthand. I was so flattered by her attention and dedication that I never questioned why she needed such detailed documentation for a single Thanksgiving meal, or why she seemed more interested in learning my secrets than simply enjoying our time together in the kitchen as we'd done when she was growing up. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving, Sarah called to confirm that I didn't need to bring anything except myself, that she had everything under control and was actually excited about surprising me with how well she'd recreated all my signature dishes. And I remember feeling a bittersweet mixture of pride and nostalgia as I realized my little girl had grown into a woman capable of carrying on our family traditions. I spent Wednesday preparing myself to be a guest in someone else's home for the first time in decades, choosing a nice dress instead of my usual cooking apron, wrapping the small hostess gift I'd picked out for Sarah, and allowing myself to imagine how wonderful it would be to sit at someone else's table and simply enjoy the meal without worrying about timings and temperatures and making sure everyone had everything they needed. Thursday morning arrived with the crisp November air that always made me think of gratitude and family, and I woke up feeling genuinely excited about this new chapter in our Thanksgiving tradition. Imagining myself seated at Sarah's beautifully set table, watching her serve the dishes I'd taught her to make, seeing her face glow with pride as family members complimented her cooking and recognized the familiar flavors of home in every bite. I arrived at Sarah's house at exactly 2 o'clock as instructed, carrying my hostess gift and wearing my best smile. But when I knocked on the door, nobody answered. And when I tried calling Sarah's phone, it went straight to voicemail with a message that sounded rushed and distracted. I walked around to the backyard, thinking maybe they were enjoying the unusually warm weather outside, but the house appeared empty except for cars in the driveway that I recognized as belonging to my son Michael, my daughter-in-law Lisa, and my grandchildren, which meant the family was definitely there, but apparently not answering the door. After 20 minutes of knocking and calling with no response, I used the spare key I'd helped Sarah hide under her decorative rock when they first moved in, calling out as I entered to announce my presence and apologize for letting myself in, but the house was silent, except for the distant sound of laughter coming from what seemed to be the basement. I followed the sound downstairs and discovered the entire family gathered around Sarah's big screen television, watching football and snacking on appetizers. But there was no sign of any Thanksgiving preparation. No turkey in the oven, no side dishes warming, no table set for dinner, just my family lounging in casual clothes like it was any other Thursday afternoon. Sarah looked up when she saw me and had the audacity to seem surprised, as if she'd forgotten inviting me. And when I asked about dinner, she exchanged glances with Mark before explaining that they'd decided to order pizza instead because cooking seemed like too much work and they wanted to just relax and enjoy the game. I stood there in my nice dress, holding my hostess gift, staring at my family who had somehow forgotten that Thanksgiving wasn't just about food, but about gratitude and togetherness, and honoring the traditions that bind families across generations. And I realized that I'd been systematically excluded from a celebration I'd been hosting and nurturing for most of their lives. But then Sarah delivered the real blow, explaining with fake sympathy that they'd actually already eaten, that they'd decided to have their Thanksgiving meal earlier in the day at Mark's parents' house, and they'd tried calling me, but my phone must not have been working, which was interesting since my phone had been working perfectly and showed no missed calls from any of them. The cruelty was breathtaking in its casual delivery, the way she explained their betrayal like it was a simple miscommunication rather than a deliberate exclusion. The way Mark nodded along like this was all perfectly reasonable. The way my grandchildren avoided eye contact like they knew something shameful was happening but didn't have the courage to speak up. I asked Sarah why she'd had me spend weeks teaching her my recipes if she never intended to cook Thanksgiving dinner, and her answer revealed the true depth of their deception. She explained that she'd wanted to learn my recipes for future use, that this year they decided to start new traditions that were less stressful and more suited to their lifestyle, that maybe I could join them next year if I was willing to be more flexible about how holidays should be celebrated. The word flexible hit me like a slap, implying that my 40 years of hosting and cooking and creating memories for this family had been inflexible rather than devoted, that my traditions were burdensome rather than beautiful, that my role as matriarch was outdated rather than honored. I looked around the room at my son Michael, who couldn't meet my eyes, at my daughter-in-law Lisa, who was suddenly very interested in her phone, at my grandchildren who were pretending to be absorbed in the football game, and I realized that this hadn't been Sarah's idea alone, but a family conspiracy to phase me out of holidays I'd been anchoring for decades. The worst part wasn't the exclusion itself, it was the cowardice behind it. The way they'd all agreed to hurt me, but hadn't had the courage to be honest about their intentions, choosing instead to manipulate and deceive me while stealing the recipes that represented generations of family love and tradition. I left without saying another word, driving home in silence while my mind processed the magnitude of their betrayal. And when I walked into my own kitchen, I was greeted by the sight of grocery bags full of Thanksgiving ingredients I'd purchased to contribute to what I thought would be a family celebration. Sitting alone in my kitchen, surrounded by food that would now go to waste, I did something I hadn't done since my husband died 15 years ago. I cried. Not just from hurt feelings, but from the profound loneliness of realizing that the family I'd sacrificed everything for had grown up to become people who saw my love as an obligation rather than a gift. But grief has a way of transforming into something more powerful when you realize that tears won't change anything, but action might. So I dried my eyes and started cooking, preparing every single dish I'd planned to contribute to their celebration. Not because I was hungry, but because I needed to reclaim my power and remember my worth. I spent the evening preparing a complete Thanksgiving feast for one, setting my dining room table with my best china and crystal, lighting candles and playing soft music, creating the kind of elegant celebration I deserved, even if I was the only one there to appreciate it. As I sat down to my solitary meal, I took photos of each beautifully prepared dish, not for social media, but for documentation, because something told me I might need evidence of my efforts later, and I was learning to trust my instincts about protecting myself from people who took my generosity for granted. The next morning, I woke up to a text message that changed everything, a video sent by my granddaughter Emma with a message that said, "Grandma, you need to see this. I'm so sorry." And when I opened the file, I discovered footage that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. The video showed my entire family gathered around Sarah's dining room table that was set with my grandmother's china that I'd loaned Sarah years ago for special occasions, eating a complete Thanksgiving feast that featured every single recipe I'd spent weeks teaching her to prepare. They were laughing and toasting and complimenting Sarah's cooking, with Mark proudly declaring that his wife had outdone herself and managed to recreate all of Grandma's famous dishes without needing Grandma's help, while Lisa added that it was actually nice to have a peaceful holiday without any drama or stress from the older generation. Sarah was basking in the praise, accepting compliments for dishes she could never have made without my detailed instructions, playing the role of family matriarch while wearing the apron I'd given her last Christmas, and the sight of her serving my recipes to my family while I sat alone at home was like watching someone steal my identity and wear it better than I ever had. But the cruelest moment came when my son Michael raised his glass and proposed a toast to Sarah for taking over the family hosting duties and proving that traditions could evolve without losing their meaning. While the camera panned across faces nodding in agreement, including my own grandchildren, who were old enough to understand exactly what was happening, but young enough to go along with it.
The video was clearly meant to be a private family memory, but Emma had secretly recorded it and sent it to me because, as she explained in a follow-up text, she couldn't stand watching them celebrate excluding me while pretending I wasn't missed, and she wanted to know that at least one person in my family thought what they had done was wrong. Watching that video felt like being murdered and forced to attend my own funeral, seeing my family not just moving on without me, but actively celebrating my absence while enjoying the fruits of my decades of labor and love. And I realized that their cruelty went far deeper than simple exclusion. They hadn't just uninvited me from Thanksgiving, they had systematically stolen my role, my recipes, my traditions, and my dignity, then documented their theft like it was an accomplishment worthy of preservation. And Emma's decision to show me that video meant that at least one person in my family recognized the magnitude of their betrayal. I sat in my kitchen staring at that video for hours, watching it over and over until every cruel word and dismissive gesture was burned into my memory. And with each viewing, my hurt transforms into something harder and more focused, something that would serve me better than tears or self-pity ever could. That afternoon, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything, starting with my attorney, Patricia Holbrook, who had handled my late husband's estate and understood both my financial resources and my tolerance for disrespect, which was measuring at absolute 0. "Patricia," I said when she answered, "I need to discuss some changes to my will and trust arrangements, specifically regarding beneficiaries who seem to have forgotten the source of their expected inheritance, and I need these changes documented and legally binding before the weekend is over." She didn't ask questions, just scheduled an emergency appointment for Saturday morning and advised me to bring all relevant financial documents and a clear list of my intentions, which I was already preparing in my mind as we spoke. My second call was to my financial advisor, Robert Chen, who managed the investment portfolio my husband had left me and understood that my quiet lifestyle masked considerable wealth that most people, including my family, had no idea existed. "Robert," I said, "I need to liquidate some assets and make arrangements for a significant charitable donation, something that will make a public impact and send a clear message about where my loyalties lie now that my family has shown me where theirs lie." He was intrigued by my sudden interest in philanthropy and agreed to meet with me Monday morning to discuss options that would maximize both the tax benefits and the public recognition of my generosity to people who actually deserved it. My third call was to the local newspaper's community interest reporter, Jennifer Walsh, who had interviewed me years ago about my volunteer work with the Historical Society and remembered me as someone with interesting stories about the town's founding families, including my own. "Jennifer," I said, "I have a story about family traditions, holiday betrayal, and the importance of recognizing people who contribute to community traditions before they're gone. And I think your readers might find it both heartbreaking and inspiring if you're interested in covering it." She was definitely interested, especially when I mentioned that the story involved a significant charitable donation that would impact local families. And we scheduled an interview for Tuesday afternoon that would allow me to tell my side of the story before anyone else could control the narrative. Saturday morning, I met with Patricia and completely restructured my estate planning, removing Sarah and Michael as primary beneficiaries and redirecting their inheritance to establish the Rhea Eleanor Foundation for Elder Dignity, named after both myself and my late mother, which would provide legal advocacy and financial assistance to older adults who were being abused, neglected, or financially exploited by their own families. The irony was perfect. My children's inheritance would now fund protection for people in situations exactly like the one they had created for me. And every dollar they thought they were going to inherit would instead help other families avoid the kind of betrayal I was experiencing. Patricia helped me structure the foundation so that it would be publicly announced with great fanfare, ensuring that my family would learn about their disinheritance through newspaper coverage and community recognition of my charitable giving rather than through private notification, which seemed appropriate since they had chosen public humiliation as their preferred method of communicating with me. Monday morning's meeting with Robert was equally productive as we arranged to liquidate several investments and donate the proceeds to local food banks and senior centers, creating a public legacy of generosity that would stand in stark contrast to my family's private cruelty, and ensuring that my name would be associated with helping others rather than enabling people who took advantage of my kindness. The newspaper interview on Tuesday was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected, as Jennifer listened with genuine sympathy while I explained how 40 years of hosting and cooking and loving had been discarded like yesterday's newspaper, and how my family's betrayal had opened my eyes to the importance of supporting people who truly needed help rather than people who simply expected it. Jennifer's article ran on the front page of Thursday's paper exactly 1 week after the Thanksgiving that had changed everything, with the headline, "Local Grandmother Turns Holiday Betrayal into Community Blessing," and included photos of me presenting checks to 3 different charities, along with my story about how family cruelty had inspired philanthropic generosity. The article described my 40 years of Thanksgiving hosting, the systematic theft of my recipes and traditions, the cruel video that documented my family's celebration of excluding me, and my decision to redirect my estate toward helping other families avoid similar betrayals. And the response from the community was immediate and overwhelming. By Friday morning, my phone was ringing with calls from people sharing their own stories of family betrayal, thanking me for speaking out about elder abuse, and praising my decision to turn pain into purpose. And I realized that my family's cruelty had accidentally given me a platform to help other people in similar situations. Sarah called that afternoon, her voice shaking with what might have been anger or panic, as she demanded to know why she was hearing from neighbors and coworkers about newspaper articles and charitable donations that apparently involved disinheriting her own children, and I could hear Mark in the background coaching her on what to say. I told her that she and Michael would receive copies of all relevant legal documents by certified mail, that their inheritance had been redirected to people who understood the value of family loyalty and elder respect, and that I hoped they would think of me every time they saw news coverage of the foundation that would bear my name and represent everything they had taught me about protecting vulnerable people. She tried to claim that Thanksgiving had been a misunderstanding, that they had tried to include me but there had been miscommunication, that they loved me and wanted to work things out, but I had Emma's video evidence of their actual feelings and celebrations, so her lies fell on ears that were no longer willing to be deceived. Michael called later that evening, his approach more aggressive as he accused me of being vindictive and manipulative, threatening to contest the will changes and claim that I was mentally incompetent. But Patricia had anticipated this possibility and arranged for medical and psychological evaluations that would prove my complete mental fitness and careful decision-making process. The legal documentation was airtight, my mental competency was medically verified, and my charitable intentions were clearly articulated and well-reasoned, which meant that any contest would fail while generating even more negative publicity for people who were already being whispered about in grocery stores and church parking lots. Over the following weeks, the Rhea Eleanor Foundation grew beyond anything I had imagined, with community donations matching my initial contribution and local lawyers volunteering their services to help elderly clients who were being exploited by family members. And I realized that my personal tragedy had accidentally created something beautiful and necessary. Emma called to apologize for her family's behavior and to ask if she could volunteer with the foundation when she turned 18, explaining that watching them exclude and mock me had been a turning point in her understanding of right and wrong. And I told her that she would always have a place in my life, regardless of what her parents chose to do. The Foundation's first annual report documented 12 cases of elder abuse that had been successfully addressed, including 3 situations where adult children were legally prevented from exploiting their parents' finances. And I knew that my decision to transform cruelty into charity had already justified itself many times over. Sarah and Mark's marriage began cracking under the pressure of community judgment and financial stress as Mark's business clients started questioning his character after the newspaper article, and Sarah found herself excluded from social groups where people had read about her treatment of her mother and drawn their own conclusions about her worthiness as a friend. My recipes, ironically, became meaningless to Sarah once she realized that cooking them reminded everyone of the woman she had betrayed, and she eventually stopped preparing traditional holiday meals because the community associated those dishes with me and my generosity rather than with her theft and deception. The grandchildren started visiting me individually, sneaking over after school to spend time in my kitchen and learn the stories behind our family recipes. And I realized that the next generation was smart enough to separate themselves from their parents' mistakes while maintaining connections to the traditions that actually mattered. Christmas came and went without any contact from Sarah or Michael, which was perfectly fine, since I spent the holiday volunteering at the senior center, serving meals to people who appreciated both the food and the company. And I realized that family is defined by behavior rather than biology. The Foundation's work expanded into advocacy, education, and prevention, partnering with social services and law enforcement to identify and address elder abuse before it reached crisis levels. And every success story felt like vindication for the pain that had started this whole journey. 2 years later, I received a graduation announcement from Emma, who'd been accepted to law school with plans to specialize in elder advocacy. And I knew that at least one member of my biological family had learned the right lessons from our Thanksgiving disaster. Sarah and Michael eventually sent apology letters that read like legal documents crafted by attorneys rather than heartfelt admissions of guilt. And I filed them with all the other paperwork related to their inheritance loss, understanding that some relationships cannot be repaired, only replaced. The Rhea Eleanor Foundation now operates in 3 counties, has helped over 200 families, and bears my name on a building downtown where people come for help when their own children decide that love has an expiration date and respect is optional. I still cook traditional holiday meals, but now I serve them to people at the community center who understand that food is love made visible, and every compliment I receive feels genuine rather than entitled, and every thank you sounds sincere rather than obligatory. My Thanksgiving table is smaller now, but infinitely more grateful, filled with people who chose to be there rather than people who felt trapped by obligation. And I've learned that quality relationships matter more than quantity connections when it comes to building a life worth living. So remember this when your own family starts taking your love for granted. Your worth isn't determined by how other people treat you. Your value doesn't decrease when people fail to recognize it. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to walk away from people who mistake your kindness for weakness and your generosity for stupidity. Tell me in the comments about a time when you had to choose between enabling bad behavior and protecting your own dignity, because we all need reminders that self-respect is not selfish. Boundaries are not cruel. And sometimes the family we choose treats us better than the family we were born into. So share your story and let's build a community of people who understand that love without respect is just manipulation wearing a prettier mask.